Good morning, fifth grade. We are entering our last video about Esther and what was going on once Haman's plan basically fell apart and Esther called him out on it. So Haman's execution, that was swift justice. But the evil scheme that he set into motion, it still threatened the Jews that were there. The Jews still lived under a death sentence that was sure to be carried out unless someone intervened. And who was that person? Esther. So Esther finally revealed the plot to the king, but she still had to go back to the king and plead for her people. Because remember, the king's signet ring was what made this a law that was going to happen. So we wonder what can come out of personal suffering. Let's consider this. Esther's own security was assured. Mordecai was safely nearby, but Esther was no longer willing to be isolated in her castle based on her privileged, comfortable existence because she was the queen. She could see beyond those palace walls. And I want you to consider this. It's been said that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph over good is for good men to sit back and do nothing. Let me say that again. It's been said that the only thing necessary for evil to win over good is for good men to sit back and do nothing. Now, Esther chose to actually do something. So let's look at chapter 8, titled, Esther Saves the Jews. On that day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her, that he was her cousin. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai above the house of Haman. Now, here's the cool thing. In keeping with Persian law, when Haman was executed as a traitor, all of Haman's estate and his property became the property of the king. Now, King Xerxes gave all that to Esther, and she passed that on to Mordecai. The king also gave Mordecai his signet ring, the very ring that Haman had used to seal the death warrant against all the Jews. And that made Mordecai his new prime minister, that new second in command. Everything that the wicked Haman had acquired through grasping and greedy manipulation was simply given over to Mordecai. What an illustration this is. Proverbs 13:22 says, the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. So everything that Haman owned eventually went to Mordecai, and Mordecai took over that position. Esther spoke against the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman and the plot that he devised against the Jews. And when the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, which we know she had, and if the things seem right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke, that means to take away, the letters that were devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my own people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my family? Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So basically, the king gave Esther and Mordecai the right to write another law saying that the first law can no longer happen. Okay? So the king's scribes, or the people who wrote for the king, were summoned at that time in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews. From India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own handwriting and its own language, and also to the Jews in their handwriting and in their own language. He sent it, remember how big his kingdom was? He sent this to every single place that Haman had sent the first one. And he wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed it with the king's ring. And then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate any armed force or any people of the province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a golden crown on his head and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the capital city of Susa, shouted and rejoiced. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, everything that Haman had written to destroy the Jews, now all of a sudden, the King Xerxes realized what was happening because of Esther. And when he rewrote the law, he gave the Jews power to do what was necessary to defend themselves against anyone who would try and hurt